to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. With us today is Joshua Jahani, from the Managing Director of Jahani Associates, an investment banker who will discuss with us what are the mysterious NFTs and why they could be particularly helpful to the developing countries. And of course, the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider, that's me, Irina Zuckerman. Welcome back. Joshua, thank you for joining us. You had a recently published piece in Newsweek addressing this very topic. And personally, what I found striking is that you are addressing a controversial issue as an investment banker, whereas many in the financial world have been very skeptical of cryptocurrency, NFTs, anything blockchain related. And you are operating between the Middle East, South Asia, and of course the US. Could you tell us a little bit more about your background, what you do, and how you've come to be interested in this topic that's generally a little bit more niche?
Yeah, absolutely, Irina. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Jahani Associates is pretty simple. As you mentioned, we're an investment bank in New York City. We do mergers and acquisitions, global trade, and joint ventures all over the world. And we focus on the markets you identified in Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia, North America, and a bit in Latin America. So we're heavily exposed to these lower cost labor markets. We have many employees in these countries, and we utilize the talent. It's very high quality talent. The most recent article in Newsweek that you identified was written really to just identify that this concept of NFTs and as a tool for paying for products and services may be a equalizer. Because in fact, when you look at a lot of professional service firms in any industry, they leverage economies where usually the USD is stronger, and they pay people less to do the same amount of work. They call it labor arbitrage. Some people might call it exploitation, but this is what businesses do. And the interesting thing in the premise of the article about utilizing an NFT, a non-fungible token, to essentially pay for labor would equalize the playing field, because the NFT value wouldn't change based on if the individual was in Afghanistan, Pakistan, or Canada. And that's what drove a lot of the analysis, and the article continues to go on to several examples and different use cases for how NFTs are already, and cryptocurrency are already being used by countries like Venezuela, Afghanistan, etc.
Now, many of these countries already have a system, a market bartering or bargaining system that tourists are generally familiar with, but basically the value there is determined by what the buyers and the sellers, the vendors can agree to. Isn't that sort of similar to how NFTs would work in that context anyway?
A barter system, it could be, yes, definitely an NFT could be used as a, what kind of NFT, how many NFTs, etc., for a specific act of labor. I think that's definitely something that would play into the labor markets for these economies. But I think what was more interesting is really when you look at, and this can be specific to NFTs or cryptocurrencies in general, but in like Afghanistan, with the recent US exit, the value of the Afghan currency plummeted immensely and has no real indication of returning to the value that it had in the past, because the global market shorted it due to obvious concerns. And that meant that many Afghan families were frantically trying to put their money into cryptocurrency, into Bitcoin or Ethereum, because they didn't want to see their life savings essentially get wiped out and not be able to buy basic goods and services. And there's a couple of use cases for how this has happened. I think it relates to the pandemic a lot, but South Africa, Lebanon, Argentina, Afghanistan, a lot of these markets have had their own sort of mini or macro financial crises over the last 2 years, where their currency did get devalued tremendously. And many people, some of the largest wallet stores of cryptocurrency are in the nations I just identified. So people saw the writing on the wall and they put money into these cryptocurrencies. And that relates it to NFTs, because that means these populations and these labor markets are going to be more prone to accept payment in NFTs. And as these NFTs become more liquid, and as they have more readily available value on a market or an exchange, it suddenly allows, in theory, someone in Afghanistan or someone in Argentina to get paid one NFT to do one task, and someone in the USA to get paid one NFT to one task, which could lead to a significant redistribution of wealth.
Now, let's talk about this idea of using digital assets, which is what the NFTs basically are. How did this idea come about? Why has it become so hot in recent times? And what's the big controversy? Some people are decrying it as a scam, as a bubble. Others are saying that it's not going anywhere, that some speculative fluctuations will settle themselves out down the road. How did this become the latest trend to begin with?
Yeah, that's a good question. For better or worse, the relevance of cryptocurrency is often tied, tethered, or a proxy to the price of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin's price is driven mostly by its scarcity. And as it becomes more difficult to mine, it becomes more scarce and therefore becomes more valuable. And so if you look at a chart of the price of Bitcoin from 2014 all the way to today, you see this massive spike. And I think everyone remembers like talking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency around Thanksgiving tables around 2017, like late 2017, early 2018. And this spike in cryptocurrency fame or notoriety led to a massive increase of value. And suddenly these Bitcoins that were, or Ethereum, whatever, that were held by a select few of gamers and coders, and for lack of a better word, nerds, suddenly these Bitcoins became very valuable. And so there were scammers, and still are scammers today, most certainly, that seek to manipulate people to take these cryptocurrencies from them that have value. And one of the easiest ways to do this is to try to swap something for that cryptocurrency that has no value or less value. But I think to decry cryptocurrencies, digital securities, NFTs as broadly a scam is completely missing the point, and it's just it feels to me more like a grasp for a headline or a desperate attempt for a buzzword rather than an actual analytical analysis of what the technology of the blockchain is allowing us to do in transactions, financial transactions, and it is powerful because it's cutting out middlemen and middlewomen. So I don't agree with this general broad classification of these scams, although certainly they exist. I think overall the technology is changing our financial system and will continue to do so.
Now, aside from currencies such as Bitcoin and Ethereum and others, some of these digital assets also includes token type assets that are more like digital art and other forms of that. Could you tell us more about that? Why that's also being used as an exchange item, and why are the prices for it are skyrocketing even for relatively unknown artists?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think to understand the different types of these digital securities or these blockchain-enabled tokens, one needs to do a brief survey of just the history of the rise of these kinds of tokens and the terminology that's been used to identify them. I think there's a lot of broken nomenclature in this industry. I think the biggest broken nomenclature is one that I've used repeatedly already in this podcast, which is the fact that these things might actually be currencies. They are not. Bitcoin is not going to be an actual currency the way that cash is used by the USD, et cetera. Bitcoin is this, it's a piece of software code that is unique and that some people agreed has value enough that you can sell it on an exchange like Coinbase. It's that simple. So Bitcoin in and of itself is almost more like a collector's item or a piece of art than a currency. It is more a piece of art than an actual currency because the technology doesn't process fast enough to actually let it be used as a global currency. And so you started with cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, Ethereum, et cetera. Then they went into this ICO world and these coins, these different tokens, security token, utility token, et cetera. Then they tried to go to digital securities and they bounced around with a couple of different names or digital tokens. And now they seem to be landing on NFTs, which is really just the same terminology that we've seen. And you could call Bitcoin an NFT. What's specific about an NFT, and the reason I think it's valuable to utilize and try to accept this terminology, because the nomenclature does need to be refurbished or revamped, is that it stands for non-fungible token. And the way that NFTs are generally described is that they are specifically for some kind of piece of art. And there are businesses now that are tokenizing and creating NFTs that represent entire works of art or pieces of works of art. And it's something that people can understand very well. And there's several works of art that have been found in the press to be sold for a lot of money. It also helps sidestep a really important regulatory hurdle that, quite candidly, the Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, NFT, digital security, digital token market hasn't been able to. And this is what the SEC set a line in the sand very early on, is that these items are securities when they were bought and sold in a sort of speculative stock market kind of way. And therefore, if they are securities, they fall under the regulation of the SEC. And therefore, they need to have certain kinds of financial reporting, which they almost never do. When you focus on the NFT component, which is about a piece of art or a piece of music, they fall into the commodities category, which is a very important distinction in terms of the regulation of the assets. The commodities are less regulated than securities. And so when you focus on the fact that they're some kind of a commodity, it allows the asset to be traded more freely and lowers the cost of doing business around the asset. And I think that's a really important part of what the token blockchain community has constantly tried to do, is get away from it really being a proper security and try to make it more of a collector's item, a commodity.
If, as you say, all these items will never become an actual currency, or at least not globally,
Yep.
why is there so much concern by financial institutions, bankers, and so forth about people's investments in a commodity? Why are they concerned about that being even offered as an option?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So Warren Buffett is quoted as saying a lot of things, and I don't want to try to distill someone like Warren Buffett's opinion of cryptocurrency to a single phrase, but he was quoted as referring to it as rat poison early on in its spike in fame, the cryptocurrency spike in fame, which is a pretty aggressive statement when you think about calling something rat poison. I honestly think that early on with the ICOs and with the spike of the fame of cryptocurrencies and the fact that everyone and their cousin wanted to buy cryptocurrencies, it did lead to a lot of manipulative behavior. And classic investors, classic bankers, classic financial advisors saw that people were getting ripped off because they were spending money or Bitcoin, which clearly had value, for tokens that arguably had less value. And I think that's what people reacted to a lot in the beginning. I think when you look at the news and the journalism around cryptocurrency tokens, et cetera, today, or NFTs, that's significantly more positive, because now that people have become more familiar with it, now that the SEC has stepped in to regulate certain kinds of NFT usage or token usage, people are more comfortable. And therefore, people are able to separate the technology from the speculative asset, which has always been the problem, is that there's blockchain technology, which is totally separate from anything like an NFT or a Bitcoin, et cetera. But they were really amalgamated and considered the same early on. And that was a problem.
It seems to me that we are facing two types of reasonable concerns. On the one hand, there is an issue over speculation about an item that may lose its value because it's not, unlike a government bond or traditional currency, it's not backed either by the government word, so to speak, or by any sort of standard as used to be the case with the gold and silver standard back in the day. But on the other hand, we have the phenomena of art markets and auctions, where the demand for particular art determines the price and sets the price, and no one argues with it as anything particularly excessive, even though some paintings that may be light years away of being considered some sort of a classic raise high values on the market. Where do you see NFTs lying between these two kind of extremes? Complete lack of backing versus
Right.
the art field where this sort of speculative price setting is perfectly acceptable as the norm.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it's a really powerful way to look at this use case of NFTs is between those two extremes. On one end, it's backed by governments or faith in governments. And on the other end, it's backed by absolutely nothing, right? Which is essentially what some of these wildly speculative schemes were. And the NFT piece has tied itself to these assets that people are familiar with. And Irina, I just need to take a slight detour to talk about assets because I think it's relevant to this.
Absolutely.
So tangible assets, people are super familiar with. This is land, property, machines. Those can easily be represented by a Bitcoin, right? There's this one desk with a serial number, and there's a currency or a token that represents this desk. And therefore, if I own this token, I own all the rights to utilize this desk, etc. People understand that very easily. When you start to get into the intangible asset category, that's where there has to be a lot more structure around the kinds of assets that the NFTs actually apply for. When you look, so in the intangible asset world, the most common intangible assets people are aware of are like books, right? The words on a page, it's not the page itself that has value, but when you organize all of the words of Lord of the Rings, you have a story that has value that's separate from each of the words distinctly in the 3 books of Lord of the Rings. And that's an intangible asset, those copyrights. Same with patents and trademarks. Music is trademarked and copyrighted. It's musical notes, and they can be organized digitally, and they are scientifically distinct. And I think that's where NFTs are very successful, is that they pick these intangible assets that are familiar to people, and then it helps them avoid this wildly speculative, nonsensical thing that we have seen in the market and that has been made fun of in the news. Where people got into trouble or where there was confusion early on in the days of cryptocurrency / digital security / NFTs was where the intangible asset was something that was very, very intangible, right? So there's a book, Lord of the Rings, right? It's technically an intangible asset, but that's a very understandable item. People understand that that's distinct. But then something like a code to unlock another code in a video game online that no one has ever played, that was more wild. And that's kind of how to just make an analogy simple, where some of the NFTs went early on. The NFTs today are much more tied to things like Lord of the Rings or artwork, and that helps them become closer to your point, Irina, about it helps them become closer to the ones that are backed by the government, which are inherently more stable in the common framework of capital markets.
Now, here in the United States, we've had legal cases to determine, and I am a lawyer, so I'm a little bit biased. Legal cases to determine, for instance, whether algorithms can be copyrighted. Is there an issue of the same sort with NFTs? Are they more like a copyrighted artwork in what you just said, or are they more like a code in the sense that intellectual property is not quite the the description for that type of intangible asset.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so you're the attorney, so help, correct me if I misstate anything, but there's been a lot of patenting and copywriting and different kinds of protections placed on software.
Mm-hmm.
But software is very dynamic, and a lot of times it depends completely on the inputs that you have, and it's not as closed-ended as like the Lord of the Rings, right? You change 10 to 20 key facts of Lord of the Rings, and it starts to look like a totally different story. And so in that case of software, the ability to protect that intellectual property has been called into question. It's been less protectable because some people have really just been predatory, and then they've been very litigious around patent lawsuits and just saying, oh, I have this broad patent that covers everything around navigation systems, and therefore you can't copy my navigation system, Google Maps, right? And it starts to become silly. And I think that the use cases where we see NFTs today avoid that. And that might even be a good example of how some of the speculative use cases in the past happened, is that when it starts to become just about software, maybe it's just software for software's sake, the land can be so murky. It's very difficult to tell what exactly you're representing, and particularly if there's not like a business behind it, or if there's not actual customers, it starts to look insane. So I think that NFTs are doing a better job, and they're becoming more rational.
Now, it's very obvious to me that the specific technologies, the blockchain technologies that they used for NFTs, they are certainly intellectual property because they have the unique attributes that have to be developed by whoever. But what about the actual aspects themselves? What are they? Are they, if they're a commodity, but at the same time they can be used as a currency or as an investment into a chattel, into an artwork? Where do you draw the line between the use of these assets as a token of exchange versus copyrightable or intellectually proper attributable item in itself, versus separating it from the technology used to develop it, obviously?
So you're asking specifically about the classification of a commodity versus a security?
No. I mean, whether, given the fact that they're they are more like a commodity, but they're occasionally are used as a security, but at the same time used as an investment, almost like an art piece. Where's the intellectual property issue concerning that? The technologies used to develop each unique type of cryptocurrency or NFT, that's a separate issue. I think that's pretty easy to understand why they could be considered intellectual property. But these digital assets in themselves, to the extent that they are being used as an item of exchange and not just investment, what intellectual property attributes can be applied to them?
Yeah, that's so I think it's important to break down
let me put it very simply. If there's a unique artwork that's entirely digital, most likely it can be copyrighted in some way. But if we are talking about a Bitcoin or an Ethereum, asset, are they in themselves copyrightable or somehow, patentable?
I see. Yeah, they are. They are, because you have a specific identifier for these cryptocurrencies in the case of Bitcoin or Ethereum, just like the digital artwork is unique, right? It has to be unique. It can't just be ripped off. So I'm comfortable with where the technology exists today, and that as long as these digital assets are truly distinguishable and identifiable, then they will continue to have value. What's interesting, I think, the premise of your question, because I always think about gold, right? So gold is a commodity, and it is an investment, right? People buy gold hoping that it will go up in value, and it's not regulated as a security, at least the physical asset gold. But if you take two gold bars and you own one and I own the other one, and we both melt them down and we put them side by side, you have no idea which is which, right? They look identical. Yours, we just each own a piece of it. And that starts to get a little interesting in terms of, and this is where some of this strange financial engineering can come in, is that if you own one Bitcoin and I own one, and then you just split and split and split and split and split your Bitcoin, so you own 1,000 1,000ths of your Bitcoin, and I still own one Bitcoin, we own the same amount. You own 1,000 1,000ths and I own one, and then you start selling your 1,000ths, and then you try to, it gets complicated. And I think that kind of, there has to be a true business case behind it so that it doesn't look manipulative. But I think that behavior can quickly look manipulative, which is where issues have risen in the past.
Well, and that brings me to the question about a recent video that came up, and that's before we get back to developing countries and how that would work in their context in a little bit more depth. The recent video that went viral got millions of views, essentially joked that the entire premise of cryptocurrency is bound to end in a bubble-like burst. That none of these cryptocurrencies can be easily used, which have foundational problems. The Bitcoin is too slow to process, Ethereum has another issue, and so on and so forth. And essentially, since they cannot be easily used by masses of people as cryptocurrency, they're not really going to, they're going to lose their value sooner or later. What do you make of that? Do these foundational principles really play that role in the value of these items?
Yeah, I think that the position as you laid it out by other reporters and other pontificators in the media, it's not your position, it's other people's position. I think it makes no sense. I completely disagree. Because people like to conflate large macroeconomic activities like a global currency with these very specific technologies that solve very specific business problems, which is that transaction processing is too slow and there's not enough visibility when you don't have a central government or a central regulatory body in cross-border remittances, things like that. And that's where the technology that's used in cryptocurrencies becomes essential. Stable coins were popular, and I think they still are, but a lot of these certain kinds of cryptocurrencies, they call them stable coins, is where they're tied to like a USD. So there's a USD currency, and it has stable coin 157x012, and that stable coin can then be transacted, traded, and moved around in the financial system on just on a technology basis and a physical basis much more rapidly, and that helps save time and money. So it doesn't have to always come down to you're showing up to a street vendor in Tokyo with a wallet and you scan your wallet to buy fish. Like it's just silly. The technology is immensely valuable and it's proven itself already.
So we are seeing this vast confusion. Meanwhile, the U.S. Currency, the dollar, is being significantly affected by inflation as a result of various factors, not the least of them, government overspending. And sadly, it's very difficult for me to understand how some of these pontificators can make these vast statements about the use of substitutes for currency when the devaluation of currency by one of the most powerful countries on earth is so visible and has affected so much of global economy already. But going back from that to the issue of developing countries, and where, as you've pointed out, the currency was already devalued by other factors, where there are other issues. How do you get these NFTs to people who do not have easy access to technology?
Well, I don't think you can. So if there's no access to internet technology, things like that, then I think it excludes people from this financial system, which is why global infrastructure and things are so important, and people need to have connectivity. Connectivity is largely available. It's not perfect everywhere in the world, but I think most countries are certainly more so than even just 5 years ago, are able to get connected and online. I think what's more important, or to me more interesting, because the point of the article is that this NFT in exchange for labor, cryptocurrency in exchange for labor, can lead to a redistribution of wealth. And for example, like think about all the freelancing that happens online. It's immense, right? Is that I need, a graphic designer to take this flyer and make it look good for my son's school play or whatever. And the cost of this task to me is 1/20th of a Bitcoin. So I need someone to do this, and I'm going to pay you 1/20th of a Bitcoin. The current labor market is such that I don't necessarily say, I may have a budget, but I don't necessarily say like, I'm going to pay you $15 for this. What you do is you put a project out there and then people bid on it, and you generally go with the person with the lowest bid and the highest quality. And I think that if things are paid for in cryptocurrency, it breaks down some of that obvious arbitrage that exists in these low-cost labor markets. And that was really the point of the article, is that suddenly in Argentina, instead of getting paid 1/20th of what someone in the US is getting paid, you're both getting paid the same amount of NFTs or the same amount of cryptocurrencies, and therefore the Argentinian is making more money.
But that, but that would require the employer to buy into this idea that they want to create an equalized system. So how do you get it's very obvious to me why the employees in these countries would benefit, but how do you sell this idea to the employers? Why would they want this equalized level playing field when the whole point for them is to make money off of being able to save in costs?
Well, what if they don't know? Right. So to answer your question, is there really isn't a way, right, to just say, hey, you're going to pay more for the same, right? You're not going to save any money. They're not going to want to do that. But the premise is, if you start to imagine everything on the blockchain where it's relatively anonymized, then they wouldn't know, and they wouldn't care, right? They have 1/20th of a Bitcoin, they're going to pay for this, and so they'll do it. But what's interesting, Irina, is, so to your point, so you and I are doing this on the internet, right? And what we've all been going through as a world over the last 2 years with this pandemic has been, it's changed, right? It's changed everything. And there's this really interesting piece about NFTs and the metaverse, which the article also touches on. And people love to talk about the metaverse, but and I don't know if people always know exactly what it means, but the bottom line is that there are tasks you can perform in a purely digital environment that create tangible value in the non-digital environment. There are tasks you can do inside of games. People will pay you tokens for swords in a game. A teenager in Colorado pays a teenager in Bangladesh to get some kind of game thing, like some whatever, World of Warcraft, Minecraft, whatever the people are playing. And when you think about that, and you think about how there are these tasks inside the metaverse where people can earn these NFTs that may in fact have value, particularly if they're like artifacts in a game, that's where the point starts to become very strong, because then you're in a game and you have no idea where the other person is on the other line. And we're seeing this already, is that there's certain games and metaverse use cases where you can collect certain digital assets and utilize them for real value. And you're seeing an influx of labor in these lower cost markets today trying to take advantage of this arbitrage now in the reverse. And it's only because of the metaverse.
So the next,
yeah, go ahead, please.
So the future of labor, you're saying, to some extent, could be virtual reality.
It already is in these games, for sure. It already is, and people pay real money for these things that are inside the game, and it doesn't always go to the publisher of the game. You can buy stuff from other people inside the game.
I could see various scenarios where something that's not strictly speaking, fantasy could be gamified for various tasks, scientific experiments, war games, various theoretical studies that you want to utilize digital settings to avoid any, physical risks. And essentially, it's can be almost a type of calculation which would make it potentially reachable beyond the immediate Western market, of course. Um, Nevertheless, I still see the rhetoric, the general rhetoric is being quite reduced, not so much in what types of settings is cryptocurrency and NFTs are appropriate and have their most use, as whether they're useful at all in whether your investment just disappears. It certainly is to the advantage of developing countries if more people in developed countries buy into this concept and utilize NFTs more widely. That expands the market access for everybody. It expands the settings, of course, in which NFTs can be used. And the more people buy into it, the more successful by definition it is. And now what I'm seeing is there seems to be a concerted effort to prevent it from being successful at all, ironically, in any setting. And probably because some people do understand the financial risks of opening this playing field to wider numbers of players. That creates a more competitive situation for all involved, and of course that limits some people's or institutional power. How do you, given your position in investment banking world, where let's say there's a more conservative mindset on these issues, and there is of course a direct challenge by these situations to the powers of these financial institutions, how do you make a case for them that it's in their own best interest to expand this field, to expand the use of these digital assets, and that they will actually not just take risks but also benefit from it?
To other financial service professionals.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
I don't think it is in their best interest.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's fundamentally not. When you look at large banks, the bulge bracket banks, there's a tremendous amount of money they make and a tremendous amount of money they spend just to facilitate transactions. And if you make a transaction on a general ledger that is open to the world and anyone can see and anyone can validate, a lot of people lose their job and there's a revenue that gets lost. Banks make tons of money in the exchange between currencies and all kinds of stuff. So I think that it's not in their interest, which is why some people have reacted more emotionally in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
You said something else early on, and I think you used the word of perversion. You said they sort of distort it and pervert part of what the NFTs and the Bitcoins and stuff really are. And I think that's because people don't understand it. At the end of the day, you have to think about merchants, customers, buyers, and sellers. It's really that simple. And still, most things I think today, I don't know if it's most, but things are purchased in the real world, the non-digital world. But just like you and I are sort of in the Zoom metaverse right now, as we do more and more in the metaverse, and we need more Zoom minutes or more email credits or more storage, suddenly the utility of an actual currency, right? Forget about the Bitcoin thing, right? Because you're not showing up and buying from the street vendor in Japan, becomes very powerful. And this online digital commerce world is large and growing very quickly. And it's not just gaming. There's all kinds of business commerce that's done in it, and can certainly be done with financial transactions as well.
Do you think the future of banking is in blockchain banking, and the ability to actually deal with these digital assets as much as with ordinary currency?
I do. I think one day, I don't think it's going to be very dramatic, and I don't think it's going to be very exciting, but one day we're just going to wake up and we're going to be like, oh, my entire bank account and all of the transactions related to it are on the blockchain. Cool. Moving on. it'll be kind of be something like, it'll just happen because it's a better technology. Of course, it's a better technology, right? So it's very archaic the way this stuff is done today.
Yeah, I'm actually quite surprised because leaving aside banking itself, there are countries around the world, some of them are quite developed and some of them are very poor, that use apps to run ordinary tasks that in the US take half of your day just to do one of them, and
Yep.
elsewhere they're available all in one place digitally, and you take care of all your business, all your needs very quickly. And we are not there yet. Probably actually being overdeveloped sometimes creates these additional obstacles. But in terms of developing countries, the use of NFTs, you recently in the article you gave a dramatic example of a Nigerian artist who made a tremendous sum of money from his NFT, which, as the skeptics pointed out, he immediately converted to regular currency. How do you see this playing out in terms of these artists being able to make use of these commodities and balance it out with the need for still using regular currency? Do you think, what challenges do you foresee in that happening?
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the bigger question, because the fundamental premise, I think, of anyone that believes in this technology in this space is that the prevalence of blockchain-enabled stores of value is just going to continue skyrocketing. It's skyrocketing already. When you think about the amount of dollars, USD, that exist in some kind of blockchain-enabled asset today versus 5 years ago even, it's way higher. Right? It's way higher. So real money is going into these assets that are enabled by blockchain technology. Now, there's still a very clear sort of like special world, non-special world, right? Or tangible world, intangible world, where it's like on the blockchain or it's not. It's on the blockchain and it's not. And things that are on the blockchain generally sometimes can integrate together better, or they're more tech enabled. And so the bigger question, and the way I would interpret what you're asking me, is when is it only on the blockchain? Right? When is there no special world, non-special world? When is it only the special world? And that I don't know, right? Certainly the pandemic has accelerated it, but I mean, the number that feels right is 100 years, right? Because it's still kind of slow, and we need them, right? We need these traditional systems. We have a lot of infrastructure and business that's done on these systems. And I think that as long as there's a trade-off between that special, non-special, we're never going to really take full advantage of the technology. And to answer your question directly, people will continue to cash out. And as long as there's a cash out period, it means that someone is buying low and selling high. And that means that these other people that choose to use these buzzwords like scams or whatever will have at least something to their story, although that's an oversimplification.
Now, the most recent development that I've been hearing about internationally is that UAE is looking to become sort of a big market for cryptocurrency enthusiasts and investors and so forth, and is looking to put out its own cryptocurrency. What would that look like in your opinion, and how would that work in terms of all the other cryptocurrencies that are available?
Yeah, well, the UAE is consistently very forward thinking. It benefits from a very consolidated group of leaders that can make big decisions like this. It also is a meaningful financial hub. There's a lot of Asian and African, European and American money that flows through this region. I'm in Abu Dhabi right now. In terms of what it would look like, it's very difficult to say. I think it would start more as an internal trading value, right? Some kind of an accounting metric that the banks can use internally to transfer funds to each other, but is all tethered to a real amount of currency that's sitting tied to, in the central bank, et cetera. I think the bigger opportunity and part of why the UAE wants to do it is that they want to just start building out that infrastructure so that they can be a model, right? I mean, if you walk around Dubai, I was in Dubai the other day. I mean, it's just clearly a significant amount of effort to be the city of the future. And that means that financial transactions on an institutional level are done on the blockchain. And no one really knows what exactly that model looks like yet. Not at scale, certainly, but they'll have to figure it out. They will.
In terms of what you mentioned about the developing countries, and it certainly seems promising that if this takes off, UAE will become an even bigger possible attracting factor for these labor markets, facilitating these sort of exchanges.
Yeah,
from the sounds
that's
of it.
interesting. That's an interesting point. I actually hadn't even thought about that. So in terms of the earlier conversation we had with the special world, non-special, special, non-special, then if the UAE suddenly has a special and a non-special infrastructure, and they can integrate with the special world directly more easily, that would be very powerful. Yeah, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that, to be honest, but that makes total sense. That's a great idea.
So at the risk of being a little bit controversial, and setting off a lot of people watching this into heart attacks and so forth, I'm going to bring up El Salvador, the fact that they adopted cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, as a currency, and whether do you see any sort of competition between UAE and El Salvador in terms of trying to attract these markets? I'm not going to speculate on how successful cryptocurrency is going to be as a currency, but I do want to focus on the markets of crypto enthusiasts and crypto investors, and what do you see the future of these two different models? Whether do you see competition, cooperation, both, and what do you see of these two? What do you think about these two different visions of crypto adaptation?
It's a good question. So there has not been enough information on what exactly the UAE or El Salvador is doing, I think, to really, to provide a fully thoughtful answer to your question and the topic. I do think that El Salvador as a market compared to the UAE is not a relevant market. The UAE is a much more meaningful financial market. Perhaps a benefit could be seen by El Salvador saying that it wants to be on cryptocurrency, that providing some reassurance. I'm sure the president of El Salvador and the sheikh of Dubai know each other, I'm sure. So I think just the fact that these world leaders talk to each other, and the fact that there is a willingness to disrupt themselves, that's the most positive piece. But I think when I read that El Salvador press release, I saw it mostly as just press. I don't think that, again, like the Bitcoin technology is going to work for such a cash-driven economy. Right? So I'm on the UAE side to answer your question.
Not that you're biased or anything, but
exactly, yeah.
So do you think, in terms of technologies, eventually some of the countries currently relying on existing cryptocurrencies will shift to other types of cryptocurrencies? Do you think it's basically the issue of details rather than the actual concept that could be a challenge for El Salvador and anybody else for that matter who chooses to try to adopt this model?
Yeah, I still think that the terminology is a bit broken. I think the nomenclature still hasn't evolved to a level where we can accurately describe what we're trying to. And I mean, we're using the best words that are available, but it's not cryptocurrency, right? Like that's the whole point, right? It's this some kind of digital stores value. It should just be currency. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of USD that's just currency. I mean, it's just digital, right? So it doesn't have to be crypto. It can just be a new form of currency that has this sort of this baseline code that makes it a global general ledger. In terms of governments sharing currency, I don't think that will happen anytime soon at all. I think that's very, very far away. But certainly within certain closed systems, and then integrations between allies, and then an ability to just track and tax and tariff something, because that's really what it is. When you sell currency or move currency between nations, you're moving an asset, right? They want to tax it, they want to import it. So I'm optimistic about it.
So, and this is where I want to kind of get even more geopolitically controversial and ask about what you think about the intervention of, especially but not just authoritarian governments looking to ban all forms of crypto completely, for reasons of their, of attempting to control all financial transactions and where they go. We've heard that from Russia. We've heard that from, the similar sentiments from China, and both countries have significant populations that would probably benefit from having the sort of access to NFTs that you mentioned, but the government seem to not only be against the use of that in their context, but are looking to actively interfere with this concept to get and prevent it from happening. How do you see that playing out in larger markets?
So Russia, China, even the USA. The USA is more kind of like, meh, but it's not like pro NFT, right? It's not, Biden's not out there super excited about using cryptocurrency in the Federal Reserve, right?
Actually, there are some members of Congress that I believe are actively looking to to put a lid on it.
Oh, good,
Completely.
good. But it's certainly not like a major ticket item, at least not today.
No.
Not like it is for the UAE, right, or El Salvador, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that it will be. I think that it will continue to sort of exist in these smaller tier 2 markets.
Mm-hmm.
Just because the headache of trying to figure out how the heck to do it in the US is almost enough to make you want to make it illegal. It's like, that's just too hard. Let's make it illegal.
Although I've heard of a push to make the dollar entirely digital, so that's
it's a step, right? Yeah. I think it's more about the technology, right? In the current dollar and the digital representation we have of the dollar, utilizing blockchain, because here it works, right? So like I do tons of international transfer, or I just do tons of money transfers, right? And so if I can save money on my fees, of which we spend too much money in these transfer fees, I'm totally going to do it. And the reason banks charge that money is because there's work involved. There's compliance checks. There's all kinds of stuff. If they're able to leverage the blockchain and then provide the same solution to me, but at a lower cost, they can pass those cost savings on to me. So it just becomes capitalism 101. And then that gives them a competitive advantage in the market so that they can continue to acquire customers. So I think that's really where we'll see it, is just solving these basic blocking and tackling problems. And then that the people who solve it will become more successful. They'll become more competitive. In terms of the US government adopting it, I don't see how. I just think it will take too long. And I think similar in China, right? China's going to suddenly, they're already doing it, I'm sure. They're like, holy crap, this will save us so much time and effort in doing this international transfers or these even domestic transfers. So they will start using it, right? But they just don't want untracked currency in the country, which is China's style. So.
Mm-hmm. What in your opinion is going to be the most profitable and the longest lasting form of NFTs? Whether for the developing countries or just other types of investors, because right now there is a lot of excitement in certain circles, but that doesn't mean that whatever people are betting on is necessarily what's going to make it long term.
I see. I own some Bitcoin, not a lot, but I own some. And in my mind, the reason that I will continue to hold Bitcoin and think that it has value is because if Bitcoin is worth anything over 0, if Bitcoin is worth any positive number, then the total it can be worth is infinite. If it's worth a penny, then it can be worth $100,000, because there's no difference between a penny and $100,000. It's just perceived value, and it's just scarcity. It's perceived scarcity, and it's purely intangible. It's code. And so I think that this collectible item, which is what the NFTs really touch on, those will be the most lucrative or the most beneficial, which is why I continue to hold on to the Bitcoin that I own, is because if it's worth $1, then it can be worth $1 million. There's really no reason. Like, it's not like there's a financial statement where you're like, well, in order for it to be worth $1 million, it has to have this net profit and trade at this multiple and blah, blah, blah. None of that is there, right? It's all just speculative. And if it's worth something, then it can be worth a lot. And I think that will continue to be the case for these assets.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to ask a little bit again of a controversial question. How do you see a cryptocurrency and NFT being disrupted in itself? Because right now we're seeing those two things as innovations, but let's look beyond the present. Let's look a little bit at the future. What do you see are the opportunities for disrupting those markets and disrupting the way NFTs are currently being utilized?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for disruption. They don't do what they try to do. Let's just be honest. This is my opinion, but they sort of have this PR, and they're like, oh, we're so cool, we do all this cool stuff, and they don't really do it. They're not currencies. They're very volatile. They're not really reliable collectors, right? Go buy a Patek Philippe watch, you know, that will hold value or be worth more in a more reliable way than some of this Bitcoin. And so in that sense, I think the disruption will just become from them actually doing what they say they're supposed to do. And I think that's just a matter of time. It's a matter of technology, and it's a matter of markets. You have to have enough distributed buyers and sellers for things to reach the kind of critical mass and trading volume as in any asset class, just like real estate or anything.
So basically, overall, the naysayers may have legitimate criticisms at the moment, but in the long term, they're on the losing side.
That's correct. That's my opinion. Yes.
So in terms of all the regions that you're dealing with, where do you see this taking off the fastest, the most, and seeing the most potential for it at the moment? Because all of these regions have developing, countries that could be beneficial. All of them have their issues. All of them have also leaders in innovation and in financial investment. But where do you see the biggest future at the moment for the near future? Latin America, Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia?
Yeah. So it's Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and North America. Those are our markets. And it's definitely the Middle East. I think there's a stronger tech platform in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of really successful tech companies that do things with cryptocurrency, NFTs, whatever. Outside of Singapore, the Southeast Asian market it can be very difficult, right? Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, these are not super easy places to do business. In Latin America, the governments are weak. They just are. And so you need a regulatory body behind something like this, since it's money. And then UAE and Saudi. UAE and Saudi are not weak. They're very, very strong. They're very good with their money. They know how they have very robust and sophisticated banking systems. It's very clear with the leadership in Saudi, with MBS, as well as the Maktoum family in Dubai and the UAE, that they're committed to being disruptive. And I think that the Middle East, specifically the GCC, will outpace all the other regions significantly and intentionally.
Interesting. So basically, from the future of the Middle East being as the place of tribal conflicts and constant issues, we could see them as being leaders in innovation and disruptive technologies. That's exciting. If they can overcome the challenges. I'm hearing in particular that Saudi Arabia has faced kind of pushback, tribal pushback, banking pushback against cryptocurrency development. I'm hoping that education can set some of these issues aside, but education on crypto, on NFTs and all of that sort of curriculum I have yet to see developed, and that's probably another area where we could stand for more disruption, just basic educational issues. Right now it's kind of ad hoc enthusiasts, educating each other online. It has not been formally adapted into the traditional educational format. But then again, maybe the traditional educational format is dying in itself. So maybe,
which is the topic of the other podcast, right?
yes, exactly, exactly.
Yeah, I
Well,
agree with you. I agree with you.
well, thank you so much for coming in today. This was really, really fantastic. Because as I said, it's a hot topic, but many people don't even know what an NFT is. I've had people asking me, what is it? They've heard the acronym, they haven't really seen any examples. I wonder if one day we will see museums of NFTs, digital exhibits, and so forth, and whether sometimes digital assets will have a sort of almost a physical life of their own as well, in
Yeah,
because we see digital products becoming physical representations, so that could be,
totally.
this could work both ways, which
Yeah,
would be very interesting.
I
um
agree. I
well,
agree.
best of luck with you, and I hope to see more articles on these exciting topics, crossover of finance and innovation. I think we need a lot more of those sort of conversations, and a lot more of how something can be achieved instead of why it can't.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Thank you, Irina.
Thank you,
I
thank
appreciate
you,
your time. Thank you.
and thanks for everyone who's been watching this conversation. This was Joshua Jahani, the managing director of Jahani Associates. We were discussing NFTs, the future of the NFTs in developing countries. Stay tuned. Next week's program, same time as usual, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Tuesday nights. The Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you all for watching.